I'm Michael Fox, and this is the Prospector News Podcast. And joining me today, I have Benjamin Cox, old friend, environmentalist, and instructor with the executive program for BRIMM. Welcome, Benjamin.
Hi, Michael. Thank you for having me. It's always fun to try out podcasts. I am not a podcaster, but this is something I need to learn how to do. So thanks for giving me the chance to talk.
Timing was ideal because I could not think of a better person to be talking about this subject than yourself. So Glencore tried to buy Teck Resources, and essentially for the coal product. And over the weekend, Teck has outright rejected it, saying that really good deal for Glencore, crappy deal for Teck. Why would we do that? Let's start with the coal assets, because a lot of people don't realize that coal isn't just coal. There's different types of coal. So explain that first.
Yeah, so Glencore is trying to blend together different fundamental types of coal. And as we go to a decarbonized world, we're going to lose one type of coal far faster than we lose the other type. So the two types of coal we have are steaming coal, or coal that's used for power plants. And then we also have this thing called coking coal, which is used for metallurgical plants, whether it be actually steel plants or even strangely aluminum plants. But coking coal has an extraordinary industrial use. And fundamentally, what's interesting is Glencore has made a habit of going around and buying up distressed steaming coal assets, rather a lot of them. They've got a huge portfolio of steaming coal assets, which performed very well because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So in the last year or two, they've made a massive windfall profit on collecting these assets from other people. And now they're looking to blend what is environmentally a rather horrific portfolio into a very, very nice portfolio of high-grade coal assets that Teck has. So they're basically putting around a diamond a really, really horrible iron ring. They're combining together some not so good assets with some world-class assets to generate a pretty average asset. And the reason why coking coal is so much more environmentally valued than steaming coal is the difference between emissions that are easy to replace and emissions that are far harder to replace. We are learning how to replace power plant emissions. We've got solar in some parts of the world down to 1.2 cents a kilowatt take or pay. We've got wind power that's coming on stream. We're learning how to pair that with natural gas, and we're learning how to fundamentally make the power grid greener. That's part of the environmental solution, where we actually have solutions to the problem. We're fundamentally shifting how the grid looks, and things are getting a lot better at a rate that is just staggering. If you look at the IEA numbers around solar, the growth every year they have to readjust. It's a log growth function, and every year they think it's going to be linear. It is staggering, the difference. Coking coal, however, feeds into the steel industry, and the steel industry is an incredibly capital-intensive industry. Think roughly $5,000 minimum per ton of steelmaking capacity. And to replace the steel industry is on the order of magnitude of $10 trillion. It is a staggering bill for a relatively small part of our global carbon emissions. It's not like it's the massive part of our carbon emissions, but they're very intractable. They're very hard to remove. So what Glencore is doing is they're taking energy production assets that are fundamentally going to be non-economic within 10 years, combining that together with coking coal assets that will be in economic production for the next 40 or 50 years, and saying they're all coal. And that's just unfair to Canada. It's unfair to the Teck shareholders.
Yeah, you're taking a viable industry and or trying to buy a viable industry to replace something that's basically going to go to the way of the dinosaur really quickly. You're absolutely right in that fashion. The thing that interested me outright about this particular deal was the silence from the Canadian government. Really, is why didn't they step up quickly and say, hey, just a second, this is like a really bad idea and there's no way our competition bureau is going to approve this?
So Canada is got Glencore as a major Canadian company, and Teck is a major Canadian company. So in some ways, Canada can't play favorites, I don't believe. But who can play favorites is British Columbia. British Columbia is the one that's going to pay if their high-quality coking coal assets, which have a relatively large environmental liability that is carryable with those assets, is blended together with the global steaming coal assets. So the part of the world that's going to pay the most for this merger is actually Eastern British Columbia, where fundamentally the ability for those assets to stand alone, it's far better to be saddled with some deck to tech than to be saddled with coking coal assets that are fundamentally going to bankrupt them. Because British Columbia fundamentally needs those to be sustainable, independent, high quality assets to deal with the environmental legacy that's left behind. British Columbia is bonded by those assets from that perspective. So I don't think this is necessarily a federal issue. I think this is a regional issue. And from a regional perspective, BC should be very, very strongly not looking to merge high quality coking coal assets with low quality steaming coal assets.
Do we have both types of assets in British Columbia, or is it strictly one or the other?
Well, there are both types of assets in British Columbia for sure. But what Teck's portfolio is predominantly, almost entirely coking coal. BC is blessed with the geology that produced a very high quality global coking coal asset. It's geologically, you can also mine steaming coal in BC, but a lot of those steaming coal assets have already been turned into legacy operations. BC modernized their operations 20, 30 years ago. The coal business in British Columbia has gotten way, way, way better versus globally. Because Canada banned power plants, new coal-fired power plants, I think early 2000s. I mean, I forget how long ago it was, but it's been a long time coming. And steaming coal fundamentally needs power plants near it. And BC has fundamentally was well ahead of the curve on realizing that those things were no longer viable.
Yeah, BC has also been known long and hard for their hydroelectric power, which is again, don't need coal to fire a hydroelectric dam. So it's from that standpoint, yeah, I'm hearing exactly what you're saying. It's making a whole lot of sense. So how much longer then does the steaming coal industry really have left? Like, Glencore's trying to do this. What kind of a runway are they facing before they're going to be, essentially find themselves into trouble?
Well, the issue is the economic runway versus the psychological runway. So as long as solar gets cheaper and cheaper, which it is doing, every year as the cost of batteries goes down and the cost of solar goes down, as those two things are shifting, and they will continue to shift. There's been a micro blip increase in cost, but because of an increase of raw materials costs, but long-term, fundamentally, we're not going to run out of it. We're not going to run into a cost structure that's going to make those things non-economic. So as those things scale up, as they get better, as efficiency gets better, fundamentally, steaming coal could be non-economic in most of the world within 10 years. Because steaming coal requires a 24-hour-a-day operation, and it's very hard to make it economic when you're basically competing, like in South Australia, with almost free power for 8 or 10 hours a day. But steaming coal fundamentally needs a 24-hour base demand, and solar is fundamentally removing that from the equation. So these things are going to be in serious trouble in 5, 6, 7 years.
Now, if we're actually going to move to a nuclear power base, which, there's some speculation that that's the direction, does that speed up the death of steaming coal?
Yeah, well, steaming coal and nuclear both fit the exact same power profile because they both provide base power. So if we move globally to a nuclear power place or whatever other alternative energy along that source, those are 100% direct replaceable, at which point steaming coal is completely dead. There's no case between solar and nuclear for coal. Coal on that basis has zero long-term case. But I don't want to get into a debate about nuclear, whether it's going to work or not, because the people get very emotionally attached to that. If you want to talk about the most highly triggering version of power in the world, nuclear is it.
Oh yeah, no, definitely. It's that's definitely a triggering. There was just simply a question: if it comes online, does it speed up the death of the steam coal industry?
So no, because the time to build a nuclear reactor is so long that it's already going to die. It just adds another 5 nails to the coffin because it'll take 10 years for nuclear to ramp up. At that point, steaming coal will already be economically in far worse shape. Steaming coal really is lovely if you got a 24-hour power grid that's fundamentally power scarce, needs it, and there's no alternative. So parts of the world that are still adding coal plants are in that situation. But within 10 or 15 years, I'm not sure they will be in that situation. So we're at a point at an apex for steaming coal demand globally that economically, forget about the environmental case, forget about the need to go to zero carbon, economically is starting to become non-economic.
So in Glencore's case, then they've got a lot of steaming coal mines essentially, and they're trying to get the coking mines in because they're going to be more economical and more productive for a longer period of time. The old mines are going to have to be decommissioned and shut down. There's going to have to be a large cost associated to that. Will the profits of the coking be greater than the decommissioning? Or is it,
of all of that steaming coal assets, it's like taking a beautiful 2-carat diamond and putting it around 10 pounds iron. I don't know that I don't think it's BC's responsibility to clean up coking coal assets in the rest of the world. Why should the BC taxpayer base have their profits be leaving British Columbia, where there's environmental liability that needs to be dealt with locally? There's selenium, there's this, there's that, there's any number of local things to pay for global environmental issues that BC had nothing to do with.
And that's essentially what's happening in this Glencore Teck merger proposal.
Yeah, and it's fundamentally, forget about, I get all the value of buying the copper and doing this and doing that and everything else. But to take Eastern British Columbia and leave them stranded from being a vibrant regional area that was built up by Teck, where Teck fundamentally built the region, Teck fundamentally has been a good corporate citizen in the region, and then saddling them with the legacy future of not so good corporate citizen of someone who's gone out and bought a bunch of stranded steaming coal assets and putting them together, that fundamentally makes a regional case incredibly toxic. It's unfair to the region.
Let's move to the coking coal business. So it's used predominantly in the steel industry. There was a report that came out last week that suggested that green steel is becoming more commercially viable. Is the coking coal industry, is it on a short runway as well, or is their runway longer, and why?
So there's two reasons why the coking coal industry runway is fundamentally longer than the steaming coal or the electricity coal market. The first one is capital. Replacing a ton of steel production, an annual ton of steel production is roughly $5,000. For that $5,000 of investment, and that's using legacy technology, the new technologies appear to be more expensive. But let's put that as an order of magnitude of $5,000 per ton of total capacity to replace a blast furnace and all of the mills around a blast furnace to make steel. You're saving 2.2 tons of carbon. So the capital intensity to reduce the carbon footprint on an annualized basis is incredibly high for the steel industry. So you need to have an effective carbon tax rate, and if you look at my Nature paper that brings forth the price of that, well in excess of $200 per ton of carbon to justify the shift to green technology. So fundamentally, the runway to lose a lot of steel blast furnaces is going to happen this way. The first one is we're going to retrofit older blast furnaces to fundamentally meet better carbon standards. And there's all sorts of wonderful technologies to produce byproducts, co-products, reuse hot air, do this, do that, and everything else. And they can probably drop the carbon footprint of a blast furnace from 2 to 1. So they can basically drop the carbon footprint of the steel industry by 50% using legacy assets. That is the easy part of the steel emissions to remove, and that has an economic return on capital. Some of these papers are arguing in the $50 to $100 per ton of carbon unit basis. That last 1 ton of carbon, which by the way is driven from coke and driven from coking coal, is almost impossible to remove. You're going to need a $500-600 carbon clearing price to pay for it. And as a society, if we had that much money to invest into reducing the carbon footprint, there's 101 other things, including light bulbs, heat pump, hot water heaters, retrofitting the entire copper industry, changing pumps globally. We have got 1,000 things ahead of us, ahead of that particular upgrade on our carbon decarbonization map, including replacing all the steaming coal production in the world. So that last bit of intractable emissions means that I believe we're going to be using coking coal in 100 years from now. It'll take us 80 or 100 years to replace the steel industry. It could take us 20 to 30 years to fundamentally get to the point where steaming coal is non-economic on a global basis. Moment carbon taxing is in at any reasonable price, steaming coal is out the door, coking coal will still be there all day long.
When I hear the environmental movement rail against coal, they don't seem to differentiate between the coking coal and the steaming coal, or like, do they not understand the difference, or is it just non-pragmatic argument?
I have this lovely story. I was on the train talking about carbon footprints from Heathrow Express on the Heathrow Express into London. And I was sitting next to a senior managing director of a tier one London-based global investment bank. And this person did not know who BHP was at that point, which is like number 4 on the FTSE 100 list at that particular moment in time, 4 or 10 or somewhere in that range. People are very good at lumping things. People, because they've got low mental capacity, I'm not saying that in a bad way. We all have lots of things to worry about. Did our kids get to school on time? Did we pack their lunches? Did we do this? Did we do that? Does our car need an oil change or a battery fix up or whatever's going on in that part of our world? We have 1,000 things on our mind. And the way we survive is we remove the cognitive dissonance and lump things together. We fundamentally bring together concepts into large packages so we don't have to worry about them. And I believe that what we have done around industrial production, because it's easy, is we've lumped steaming and coking coal together from the environmental movement perspective, because it's much easier to explain the story that all coal is bad, then some coal is better than others. Because we fundamentally need to minimize the amount of cognitive work we're doing as we push change. So I believe the environmental movement has very strongly pushed for unified vision on coal, because that's the easiest story to sell. But I'm not sure that is the right story to sell. And I think that fundamentally shortchanges the regions like Eastern British Columbia in terms of the global, which is the global where we're going with the world. So I think that there's been very much an environmental movement need to simplify stories, which is just fine until the region that's getting simplified actually is needing the business to function.
So economics trumps the environment in this particular case, is what you're saying, because the investment cost to completely replace versus the return on investment for the carbon reduction is not economically there.
If I had $10 trillion to replace the steel industry, and I invested that $10 trillion into better water pumps, into better heat pumps for hot water in people's houses, into better, I can pick 4 other things that need to be done. I could take $10 trillion and get 3 times the environmental footprint purely by working on other things. The return on environmental investment in the steel industry to get from 2 tons to 1 ton is rational, but to get from 2 tons to 0 is going to be very, very high for the next 30 or 40 years. And we have other much lower hanging fruits for that environmental dollar. We have to start making a list. We have to start going from the perspective that all carbon is bad, which it is all bad, and start figuring out what carbon can we get rid of quickly, because we're in a race. And right now what we're doing is we're handicapping ourselves because we're tying together reasonably strong stories like solar and steaming coal with reasonably weak stories like coking coal and steel. And we're saying, oh, you two environmental causes must run hand in hand, coupled together. When the reality is one of them is fundamentally already economically on the way out, as we're shifting the time of day power costs down, and we're shifting how the power grid set up. And the other one is actually reasonably strong. And that means that from a British Columbia or from a Canada perspective, we need to actually start looking at how we define coking coal in some ways almost as a critical mineral. You fundamentally change the conversation around coking coal because it's fundamentally rational from that perspective.
Given that this is a regional issue for British Columbia, and given you're dealing with 2 pretty large Titanic companies in Glencore and Teck, at what stage, because let's be honest, Glencore's not going to give up at the first no. At what stage does the British Columbia government need to get involved in this process to say this is a bad idea and there's no way this is going to happen?
The Keevils are British Columbia, and British Columbia is the Keevils. The golden share in Teck is held by a British Columbian family. So let's be very clear that BC has enough of a mandate in Ottawa, that BC has enough of a mandate in their golden share structure, that BC has enough of a mandate to protect this asset. So whether it's the BC government or Ottawa, it is rational to protect regions. And it's quite interesting in a parliamentary system how valuable it is to have strong economic regions like Eastern British Columbia to carry the country. You go to Eastern British Columbia and it is a vibrant, economically lovely place where things are actually happening. And it will not be that way under Glencore necessarily if the steaming coal and coking coal assets are put together, because it wouldn't be Glencore, it'll be New Coal Co. is what they're calling it. They didn't bother to name it with something fun.
No, no. Well, Glencore was never in the creative industry, that's for sure.
Yeah, I mean, Metals Co. versus Coal Co. I mean, that's that. I mean, and the funny thing is, Coal Co. is also going to have ferroalloys because they're getting rid of the ferroalloy business at the same time, which we can talk about it for a whole longer perspective.
Yes, definitely. Now let's spin this back to Teck then. Is this going to give Teck pause to take a look at their assets and look at spinning their coking coal assets out into its own company? Is that a viable alternative for Teck?
I don't know. In my mind, it never made sense to me for Teck to spin out the coking coal assets, but I get why the new CEO is doing it from an ESG perspective. And they're not really spinning them out. They're spinning them out and taking back most of the earnings for the next 10 years. So in some ways, they're buying themselves a hedge. I don't think that what they're doing is necessarily bad. In my mind, if I was Teck, I would keep the coking coal assets as part of the large portfolio, but I can also see reasons to spin them out. I'm less concerned about them being a standalone company. I think as a standalone company, they stand a long chance of being viable in that region for a very long time. But the way I describe it is differently. I would look at it from the perspective of Teck. If they spin them out as a standalone company, anyone who buys that company is going to pay the premium that company is worth based on the coking coal profitability and the profitable basis. And they would never in a million years go take that premium and go buy steaming coal tomorrow. Whoever owns that company is not going to add in more steaming coal tomorrow if they have a standalone company. So no, I don't know that. I'm not going to be positive or negative about the spin out. I think a clean spin out is far better than a blended spin out into a multi coal stream that fundamentally includes coal fired power plants economics.
Okay, well, that clears up the whole debate around this deal. It's, in the space of a week, we had offer, rejection, and statement of why it was a bad deal without really any clarification on it. And this puts a lot of meat on those bones, so we as Canadians can understand why this isn't necessarily a good deal for British Columbia or for Canada, let alone being a good deal for Teck. So,
but let's be very clear. I'm not a Canadian. I would love to be one. I'm actually an American, but I do work at UBC, and I do think as someone who's very invested in British Columbia as a province. So I fundamentally do believe that BC does have an incredibly strong story. And I think that we have to be focused on the local when we make global decisions. We have to be focused on protecting the local to a degree. And this is an instance where Canada is not getting the best deal for Canada. And in that region, we're very much not getting the best deal.
Definitely. Okay, well, thanks for joining me today on this discussion. I'm sure when the next salvo comes from Glencore, we're going to have some more things to talk about with that. And I'm looking forward to having you on to talk about BRIMM and other topics as we move forward.
Thank you very much.
The Prospector News Podcast is for educational purposes only. The opinions expressed are those of the participants and are not to be taken as investment advice. Listeners need to do their own due diligence and seek advice of a licensed investment advisor.